It wasn't a welfare check. It wasn't a panicked 911 call in the middle of the night. It was quieter than that. Quieter, and in some ways, more troubling. On the morning of August 20th, 2000, a scheduler at University Medical Center in Tucson made a routine call to a staff nurse who hadn't shown up for her shift. No answer. A second call. Still nothing. By 11:30 a.m., the supervising nurse flagged it. Linda Watson hadn't called out. She just never came in. In hospitals, absences matter. Minutes matter. And for Linda, who had worked there for years without incident, this wasn't just a fluke. She was consistent, reliable, punctual. A single mother with custody hearings ahead and a daughter she fiercely protected. Linda didn't just disappear. Her mother, Marilyn Cox, arrived at Linda's house on West El Camino del Cerro that afternoon. She used a spare key. The front door was locked from the inside. Linda's silver vehicle was parked in the drive, untouched. Inside the house, everything looked ordinary, until it didn't. There was a cup of coffee on the kitchen table, lukewarm. The television was off, the blinds drawn, her purse was inside, so were her keys. Her cell phone was charging near the entryway, still plugged in. Her bed was neatly made, no obvious signs of violence, no overturned furniture, but her work uniform, laid out the night before, was still folded on the edge of the bed. To anyone else, it might have passed as a quiet home, but Marilyn had raised Linda. She knew what wasn't right. The blinds had been drawn. Linda didn't do that. The cup of coffee was half full. She always finished it, and the cat's food bowl was empty. Linda wouldn't leave without feeding the cat. She called the police just after 3 p.m. Tucson PD dispatched an officer to the house. The officer completed an initial walkthrough and filed a report. No signs of forced entry, no indication of foul play, subject classified as missing adult. The case was logged. A report was typed, the officer left. But to Marilyn, and to the few close friends Linda had confided in, the case wasn't about a woman who might have left town on a whim. It was about custody, about pressure, about a sense of dread Linda had been carrying for weeks. A search began that evening, first informal, then procedural. Calls were placed to local ERs, hotels, shelters, jails. No sign of Linda Watson. Her bank account remained untouched. Her social security number wasn't used. Her daughter, Jordan, just 4 years old, was staying with her father that weekend as part of their court-ordered arrangement. He hadn't heard from Linda either. At least that's what he said. David Watson was a respected man in the community. Captain Watson, Tucson Fire Department. He had filed for divorce from Linda 2 years prior. It had been contentious. Police had been called to the home multiple times during their separation, but no arrests were made. Linda had accused him of intimidation. He accused her of instability. They were locked in a bitter custody battle. On paper, it was just another broken marriage. But underneath, investigators would later say, there were stress fractures forming long before Linda vanished. When questioned, David said he had worked an overnight shift and had no contact with Linda that day. His time card confirmed a full shift. No red flags, at least not then. He appeared calm, compliant, even helpful. Asked if Linda could have left voluntarily, he replied, "It wouldn't be like her, but I suppose anything's possible." Still, detectives noted something subtle. He never asked for search updates, never contacted detectives again, never called Marilyn to check on the status of the investigation. For a man whose daughter's mother had vanished, it was minimal. Within 48 hours, the Missing Persons Unit began coordinating with detectives. Flyers went up. News stations ran a local segment, but leads were limited. No witnesses, no surveillance footage. The area where Linda lived was semi-rural, the kind of quiet desert community where porch lights flicker but rarely illuminate trouble. Days turned into weeks. Marilyn made calls daily. She visited the station. She begged for cadaver dogs, for air support, for anything. But the trail was cold. Then, 3 weeks after Linda's disappearance, detectives returned to the home with a search warrant. Not because of new evidence, but because something had bothered them on the first walkthrough, the living room carpet, specifically a section near the hallway that had been aggressively shampooed, almost too clean compared to the rest of the room. There were faint traces of chemical cleaner in the carpet fibers, elevated levels of sodium hypochlorite, consistent with bleach-based agents. Crime scene techs took samples. A small reddish-brown spot, barely visible to the eye, tested presumptive positive for blood. It wasn't much, not enough for DNA, not enough for a charge. But it was a start. A forensic analyst later put it this way: someone tried to make sure that room told us nothing. That, in itself, tells us something. No fingerprints out of place, no shoe impressions, no signs of forced entry or broken locks. But for the detectives involved, a suspicion was beginning to take shape, one they couldn't yet prove. And so the case stalled. Not for lack of effort, but for lack of evidence. Linda Watson was listed as a missing person. Her file was tagged, but not active. Her daughter stayed with her father. Her house was eventually sold. Her clothes donated. Her story faded from headlines. But her mother never stopped pushing. Linda Watson, 35, vanished without a trace in August 2000. Despite no immediate signs of foul play, early inconsistencies, including a suspiciously clean carpet and uncharacteristic absences, prompted quiet concerns within law enforcement. With little physical evidence, the investigation stalled, leaving behind only silence and a mother unwilling to believe her daughter simply walked away. The first full forensic assessment of Linda Watson's home produced minimal hard evidence. But what investigators lacked in volume, they found in precision. Trace bleach residues in one carpet segment, no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no DNA matchable to another individual. The scene was sterile, too sterile for a house last occupied by a woman who had vanished without a trace. That incongruity moved the case from passive documentation to active suspicion. Detective Brian White, who was assigned to the Missing Persons Division at the time, noted in his report, "The residence presents a disproportionately low environmental signature for a missing adult case, indicators of intentional sanitization present." The analysis was procedural, but the undertone was clear. Someone had cleaned and cleaned selectively. In parallel, the custody battle between Linda Watson and her ex-husband, David Watson, was reviewed. Civil court records from the previous 2 years showed a progressive escalation in legal filings, temporary custody orders, allegations of harassment, contempt motions. The most recent court document, dated just 2 weeks prior to Linda's disappearance, reflected Linda's request to limit David's visitation time, citing concerns over emotional instability and controlling behavior. Her attorney filed a motion to introduce a personal letter Linda had written, which read, in part, "If anything happens to me, I want it known that I feared for my safety." That letter, though inadmissible as direct evidence in criminal court, became relevant context in the investigative file. So did the calendar discovered in Linda's kitchen drawer, marked with court appearances, visitation exchanges, and handwritten notes beside some dates. Tense call, he was angry, don't go alone. Investigators cross-referenced those entries with call logs. Most lined up, a few didn't, but one detail stood out. On August 19th, the day before Linda went missing, she had written, "Court Monday, he's not going to like this." There was no elaboration, no document attached. Her lawyer later confirmed that Linda planned to request full custody based on what she claimed was a new incident, but she hadn't provided documentation yet. That incident, whatever it was never filed. David Watson, when brought in for a formal interview, maintained that he had last seen Linda a few days prior during a routine custody exchange. He confirmed he was on shift the night she went missing. The time log confirmed this, with his ID badge showing swipe access at 7:03 p.m., 10:15 p.m., and 3:01 a.m. at Station 12. The swipe data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. It suggested presence, but not continuous movement. There was no log between 10:15 p.m. and 3:01 a.m., a 5-hour window unaccounted for by digital activity. No station door access, no logged radio activity, no dispatch records of outgoing calls. A peer firefighter who shared the overnight shift later stated in a separate interview that Watson had stepped out for a while that night. When asked to clarify, the colleague responded, "I didn't ask. He was a captain." Meanwhile, Linda's voicemail records were pulled. A 28-second message from an unknown number came in at 10:49 p.m. the night she disappeared. The call was too short to record audio, and the number was later traced to a disconnected prepaid phone with no subscriber information. Cell tower data showed it pinged just 2 miles from Linda's home at the time. The device was never recovered. A forensic team also analyzed the cat food bowl, stainless steel, fingerprint lifted, nothing usable. But the bowl was dry, meaning Linda had either failed to feed her cat or had done so unusually early. According to her mother, Linda always fed the animal before work, around 6:30 a.m. The cat had shown signs of dehydration when Marilyn arrived at the house. A vet consulted by the department estimated it had been 24-30 hours since its last proper feeding. Timeline compression placed the likely time of disappearance between 9 p.m. and midnight on August 19th. At this point, no human remains had been found. There was no crime scene. But the metadata, badge logs, call traces, absence of financial activity, and behavioral consistency began to outline a profile not of a woman who ran away, but of one who had been removed. Linda's closest friends and family were interviewed. The consensus was consistent. She had no plans to leave town. Her daughter was everything to her. She had just purchased school supplies, she had paid bills, she was preparing for trial, she had plans for Sunday brunch. There was no psychological profile to support a voluntary disappearance. The case wasn't cold yet, but it was stagnant. Without a body, without an eyewitness, and without a confession, the statute of limitations for prosecution on any related charge, excluding murder, would eventually become a barrier. Still, the file was reclassified internally from missing adult non-endangered to suspected foul play. That designation change would prove critical when new developments emerged years later. At the time, though, it meant little to the public. The story faded from news cycles. Linda Watson became another unresolved name on a long list of disappearances. Tucson PD maintained a case file, but resources were limited. Focus shifted elsewhere. Until, in September 2003, another call would shake the case open again, and this time, it wouldn't be about a disappearance. It had been over 3 years since Linda Watson vanished. The investigation into her disappearance was technically still open, but it was inactive. No new leads, no active surveillance, no further search efforts. There was no confirmed crime scene, no body, no suspect. With no prosecutable evidence and no sign of Linda's whereabouts, the case drifted into administrative limbo, held together only by her mother's persistence. Then, on September 14, 2003, a 911 call was placed at 12:52 p.m. A man reported hearing gunshots in a quiet neighborhood just west of North Silver Bell Road, on the outskirts of Tucson. When first responders arrived at the residence on West Trails End Road, they found 2 women shot to death in the driveway of a suburban home. Both victims had been struck multiple times at close range with a small caliber firearm. There were no signs of robbery, no struggle, no stolen items. Nothing appeared out of place inside the house. The victims were quickly identified: Marilyn Cox, age 63, and Renee Farnsworth, age 53. Marilyn was Linda Watson's mother. Renee was her longtime friend and support figure. They had just returned home from a court hearing related to the custody of Jordan Watson, Linda's now 7-year-old daughter. That hearing had concluded shortly after 11 a.m. Documents later confirmed that Marilyn had been seeking extended visitation rights. Jordan was currently living full-time with her father under a court order issued after Linda's disappearance. Marilyn had been vocal in her objections and had pushed aggressively to obtain legal guardianship, citing the unresolved nature of her daughter's case and concerns for Jordan's long-term welfare. The ambush occurred less than 30 minutes after Marilyn and Renee returned from court. One neighbor described hearing 4, maybe 5 loud cracks before seeing a dark vehicle speeding away. No license plate was visible. The shooter left no shell casings behind, either due to the use of a revolver or post-action collection. Forensics located shallow bullet impacts in the gravel near the vehicle, consistent with shots fired from ground level at close proximity. Entry wounds and trajectory analysis suggested the shooter had approached on foot and fired from the passenger side of the vehicle, likely while the victims were still getting out. There were no security cameras in the area. Doorbell video surveillance was not yet common in 2003. No useful tire tread patterns were recovered. Soil samples yielded no identifiable tracks. Forensic leads were minimal. Tucson PD treated the case as a double homicide and quickly connected it to the open file on Linda Watson. Though officially classified as a separate incident, investigators acknowledged that the timing, victims, and context were too aligned to be coincidental. Autopsies revealed both women had been shot at least twice in the chest. Marilyn sustained a 3rd fatal shot to the head. Toxicology reports were clean. No defensive wounds were present. The positioning of the bodies suggested no opportunity to react, pointing toward a planned and targeted execution rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Detectives reviewed Marilyn's court filings in detail. She had named several individuals as persons of concern in her daughter's disappearance, including the same individual Linda had previously expressed fear toward in her letters. Investigators also uncovered internal emails between Marilyn and a private investigator she had attempted to hire in 2002, hoping to continue the search for Linda independently. The PI had declined, citing concerns about personal risk. When interviewed, he said, "She wasn't just looking for closure. She thought someone was going to silence her." Following the double homicide, Linda's missing persons file was officially updated to reflect probable foul play. All three cases, Linda's disappearance, Marilyn's death, and Renee's murder, were reassigned to the same homicide unit. A task force was assembled to consolidate all evidence, testimony, and forensic data. One of the first actions taken was to pull cell tower data from the vicinity of West Trails End Road on the day of the murders. Logs from Verizon Wireless showed a small cluster of device IDs pinging off the same tower during the time of the shooting. One device, registered to a former acquaintance of Linda's, was flagged, but follow-up showed he had been visiting a friend 2 houses down and had no connection to the victims. Another data point did not align so easily. An unregistered mobile device, similar in signature to the prepaid phone that had contacted Linda's phone 3 years earlier, pinged the same tower at 12:46 p.m., 6 minutes before the 911 call. The number was inactive before and after that window. It was a burner. The call log showed no activity other than 2 pings, one from West Trails End, the other from a nearby highway on-ramp heading north. The device was never recovered. In the absence of forensic breakthroughs, detectives refocused on motive and opportunity. Marilyn's efforts to reopen the custody case for Jordan had intensified over the prior 12 months. Renee had reportedly accompanied her to every court date, often serving as both moral and logistical support. The shooting took place less than 24 hours after a new motion was filed that could have shifted guardianship away from Jordan's father. From a procedural standpoint, the shooting reactivated interest in digital records tied to all known associates. Subpoenas were issued for phone and financial activity spanning 3 years. One name kept surfacing in proximity to all 3 women, Linda, Marilyn, and Renee. But without hard evidence, the investigation remained speculative. Still, within the task force, the consensus was emerging. Linda's disappearance was not an isolated case. It was the beginning. Years later, a lead detective would describe it plainly. Marilyn wasn't killed for what she knew. She was killed for what she wouldn't stop asking. The breakthrough came in the dry hills west of Tucson. On October 29, 2011, over a decade after Linda Watson vanished, a man hiking in the Ironwood Hills area came across something protruding from the ground near a weathered desert arroyo. White, rigid, partially buried. He reported it to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The object was recovered by deputies and sent to the county's forensic anthropology lab. It was a human skull. Preliminary analysis confirmed the remains belonged to an adult female. No clothing, no jewelry, no obvious identifiers were found nearby. The remains were fragmentary, but the cranial sutures and tooth structure suggested a woman between 30 and 40 years old. Investigators had little to go on beyond that. DNA was extracted from the inner bone. It was a slow process due to degradation from years of sun exposure and soil acidity. Nearly 4 months passed before the results were conclusive. In March 2012, the remains were formally identified as Linda Ray Watson. Forensic analysts began reconstruction immediately. Though only partial skeletal elements were recovered, primarily cranial and jawbone, fracture patterns were distinct. The occipital region displayed a linear depressed fracture, consistent with blunt force trauma delivered by a rounded object. There was no evidence of sharp force trauma or gunshot wound. The injury was determined to be perimortem, occurring close to the time of death. The lack of healing indicated that Linda likely died within minutes of sustaining the blow. This was no accident. The location, roughly 18 miles northwest of Linda's former residence, was secluded. No public access trails, no lighting, no surveillance. A stretch of open scrubland between 2 seasonal washes. According to investigators, it was a location selected by someone who knew the terrain and expected not to be found. The discovery reframed the case from missing person to confirmed homicide. With Linda's status changed, evidence previously considered circumstantial gained new prosecutorial relevance. The bleach traces on her living room carpet, the absence of signs of struggle, the narrowed digital movement window from her ex-husband's shift log. What had once been speculation now stood adjacent to a timeline ending in homicide. At the same time, cold case analysts reopened archived interviews. They cross-referenced testimony from 2000 to 2003 with fresh forensic data. Most notably, they re-reviewed early statements from individuals in Linda's close circle. One name, already noted repeatedly in earlier custody documents, was again at the center of discussion, but now with a new context. Access to the victim, knowledge of the terrain, and a clear motive tied to legal conflict. Task force members also submitted a new search warrant to examine archived cell site data, hoping to recover historical tower pings from 2000 near Ironwood Hills. The original records had long since expired from telecom retention cycles. However, an independent contractor affiliated with an insurance fraud division had retained anonymized location metrics for that corridor for an unrelated analysis conducted in 2001. The data showed a single device traveling through that area late on the night Linda went missing, roughly 11:38 p.m., moving westbound, stopping briefly near the site where the remains were later found, and departing within 12 minutes. The device identifier was too vague to match to a subscriber, but the data point was logged. It wasn't enough for charges, but it validated the trajectory. The autopsy report noted no binding marks, no post-mortem mutilation, no toxicology indicators due to skeletal-only remains. It was a clean disposal, methodical. Whoever placed her there did so with precision. The investigative team moved to present the new evidence to the county attorney's office. The strategy was shifting. Without an eyewitness or confession, the case would hinge on timeline compression, behavioral patterns, and cumulative circumstantial weight, now supported by the discovery of the body and blunt force trauma findings. Linda Watson had not disappeared. She had been killed, and her body left in the desert to be erased by time. Her daughter Jordan was now a teenager. She had lived longer without her mother than with her. Prosecutors discussed the psychological component of the crime, the motive extending beyond control and into silencing. Investigators proposed that Linda's pursuit of sole custody had triggered the act, aligning with court filings, journal notes, and behavior described by close contacts. All that remained was to translate those patterns into a case that would survive the threshold for indictment. The skull changed the classification. It gave the task force the first forensic point that couldn't be disputed. By early 2013, the investigation had shifted from speculative reconstruction to forensic patterning. With Linda Watson's death confirmed and the cause identified as blunt force trauma, detectives turned back to the night she disappeared, not to revisit old alibis, but to interrogate digital silence. In structured casework, gaps matter, specifically unexplained intervals between data points, what a subject does when the surveillance stops tracking. Investigators returned to the Tucson Fire Department's internal access logs from August 19, 2000. David Watson's name appeared 3 times on the record: badge in at 7:03 p.m., building access at 10:15 p.m., and again at 3:01 a.m. 5 hours and 46 minutes passed between the second and third data point. During that window, no movement was captured on internal station logs, vehicle dispatch records, or outbound calls from Station 12. The shift captain at the time, now retired, recalled Watson being off the floor that night. No formal complaint was filed. In 2000, departmental culture wasn't built for flagging behavioral anomalies unless safety was compromised. There were no GPS logs on emergency vehicles. Tucson wouldn't implement that system until 2004. In absence of direct tracking, the team requested city traffic cameras for the nearest arterial roads, but footage from that period had been overwritten long ago. Instead, they focused on physical access cards, specifically which vehicles could have left the station without triggering a log. Station 12 operated with 5 fleet vehicles. 3 were in use during the night shift. 2 remained parked. Forensic mechanics examined maintenance logs and found a handwritten note dated August 21, 2000. Unit 2 returned with undercarriage dirt, washed next morning. The entry had not been digitized. Unit 2 was a Ford F-250 utility vehicle, often used for non-emergency errands. No mileage log was filed that night. Photographs of the vehicle no longer existed, but when pressed, the garage supervisor at the time recalled the wash being unusual because it was done off schedule. The vehicle was gone. The records were partial, but the metadata aligned with a possibility. A fire department truck could have been used to transport a body in a window where its driver had no alibi, to a desert ridge where the remains would lie undisturbed for over a decade. The evidence was circumstantial, but it wasn't isolated. Separately, a forensic review of Linda's home revealed another anomaly, one overlooked during the original investigation. Carpet padding removed from the hallway in 2000 had been archived in long-term storage. With updated testing, technicians identified trace amounts of human blood proteins within the foam. The sample wasn't viable for full DNA sequencing, but the blood type matched Linda's, O positive, and the presence of leukocyte traces confirmed it had come from a living source at the time of spill. The impact pattern was consistent, with vertical force followed by lateral drag. According to the forensic analyst, it read like someone fell or was dropped and then moved. With the body confirmed, the scene took on new weight. That hallway wasn't just a staging area. It was likely the primary crime scene. Prosecutors reviewing the case began categorizing the sequence as a chain: motive tied to custody proceedings, opportunity through occupational flexibility, means via access to departmental vehicles, and concealment through a deliberate sanitization of the home. One final detail surfaced from civil filings. A month before Linda's disappearance, she had filed an emergency motion to restrict visitation after alleging a confrontation during a custody exchange. The petition was denied for lack of corroborating evidence, but the motion now provided a legal timestamp, one that directly preceded the crime. The case was entering a prosecutable phase. There was still no confession, no eyewitness, and no conclusive physical trace linking the suspect to the remains. But what had once been a loosely connected timeline was now forming into a chain of action, one that investigators believed could hold in court. For the first time since 2000, the District Attorney's Office authorized preparation for a grand jury. In 2014, the Pima County Attorney's Office began compiling the case for grand jury review. The challenge wasn't what to present, it was how to structure it. Individually, each data point had limitations, but aligned chronologically and forensically, the collective pattern presented a sustained trajectory of motive, access, and concealment. Investigators prepared a sequence file outlining 13 critical events between January 2000 and October 2011. Custody filings, unreported vehicle activity, undocumented badge swipes, recovered remains, partial blood traces. Each was assigned a timeline marker and corroborated with affidavits, court orders, or forensic results. The key was not in proving any one moment definitive, but in establishing that the defendant's proximity, behavior, and decisions were consistent with a person orchestrating a controlled disappearance, followed by prolonged misdirection. A newly assigned investigator on the task force re-examined past interviews and noted a pattern in emotional escalation around legal decisions. Linda filed her final custody modification request on August 17, 2000. She vanished August 20th. Marilyn and Renee filed for permanent guardianship in early September 2003. They were killed the same day they returned from court. The correlation wasn't coincidence. It was reactive patterning. Forensic psychology consultants brought in by the prosecution submitted an offender profile. It identified key behavioral traits: controlled affect, need for situational dominance, low empathy threshold under perceived threat. The profile closely aligned with the subject previously interviewed in all 3 deaths. Though not admissible as proof of guilt, it was used to inform the prosecution's risk analysis for jury comprehension. Meanwhile, the investigative team located a previously overlooked statement. In 2001, a neighbor had mentioned seeing a large white truck parked several houses down from Linda's home the night she went missing. At the time, it had not matched any registered vehicle on the case file. But with Unit 2, the Ford F-250, now under scrutiny, the color and profile aligned. The original witness had passed away, but her 2001 interview transcript confirmed she had identified the vehicle as a work truck, not a sedan. It was enough for the team to request fire department maintenance logs for all units matching that description. One entry from September 2000 noted rear seat hinge damage, repaired internally. The damage had not been previously reported or linked to any incident. Taken alone, a broken seat meant little. But with the trajectory of data already established, it suggested post-use concealment or hurried reassembly. In late 2014, 2 independent experts reviewed the case files. One focused on forensic timing, the other on investigative consistency. Both reached the same conclusion: the case would likely meet the threshold for indictment, assuming the grand jury accepted circumstantial convergence as evidence of sustained intent. On April 24, 2015, the grand jury convened. After a 4-day presentation, the indictment was returned: 3 counts of first-degree murder for Linda Watson, Marilyn Cox, and Renee Farnsworth. The arrest was made within 72 hours. David Watson, then a captain with the Tucson Fire Department, was taken into custody without incident. It had been 15 years since Linda disappeared. The trial began in January 2017 at Pima County Superior Court. David Watson faced 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution entered with no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no direct forensic link tying him physically to the crimes. Their case relied on continuity, an alignment of timeline, motive, digital gaps, departmental irregularities, and reactionary behaviors. Their argument: a man who had the motive to act, the means to do it, and the consistency of control to cover it up across multiple years. The courtroom was under scrutiny, both from the legal community and the public. Linda Watson had disappeared in 2000. Her remains were not recovered until 2011. Marilyn Cox and Renee Farnsworth were murdered in 2003. 15 years had passed from the first event to indictment. The defense emphasized this from opening statements, framing the delay as indicative of uncertainty and conjecture. The prosecution focused instead on forensic triangulation. They called in forensic analysts who re-examined the preserved carpet padding from Linda's home. The technician testified that the biological trace was consistent with a medium-volume impact event and a subsequent cleanup. Though degraded, the pattern showed clear disruption. It was not a spill, it was directional. Another witness, a retired fleet mechanic, testified about the unusual early morning cleaning of a station utility vehicle in August 2000. He confirmed the timing was outside standard policy. When pressed, he acknowledged that the rear seat mechanism was later reported broken and repaired internally. There was no explanation logged for the damage. A forensic anthropologist walked the jury through the condition of Linda's remains: skull fracture, isolated cranial discovery, lack of soft tissue due to environmental exposure, no defensive wounds. The expert stated plainly that the injury was likely incapacitating or immediately fatal, and consistent with blunt force trauma at close range. The manner of death was ruled homicide. The digital records expert reconstructed David Watson's logged activity on the night Linda disappeared. Badge in at 10:15 p.m., no activity until 3:01 a.m., no station log entries, no engine runs, no radio transmissions, a 5-hour block without traceable movement. Paired with a recorded cell tower ping near the location where Linda's remains were found, the prosecution drew a corridor of untracked behavior during the only hours she could have been killed and disposed of. They presented the court documents from family court, showing Linda's final custody motion filed days before her disappearance. They followed with Marilyn and Renee's visitation filing, documented just before they were ambushed and killed in broad daylight. The prosecution called it a pattern of silencing, applied consistently to individuals challenging Watson's custodial control. The defense challenged the absence of direct evidence: no fingerprints, no DNA match, no recovered weapon. They argued that each element introduced by the prosecution was circumstantial, and that together they amounted to coincidence, not conspiracy. They highlighted alternative possibilities: unknown persons, retaliatory actors, opportunistic violence, and maintained that the time elapsed had eroded the clarity of truth. But the prosecution countered that time had preserved something else: the consistency of behavior. The one person who connected all 3 deaths, the only person whose access, legal incentive, and movement pattern overlapped with every crime. As the trial neared conclusion, the state did not rely on a final flourish. They relied on accumulation. The jury began deliberation on March 13, 2017. It took them 2 days. On March 17th, David Watson was found guilty of all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed. He received 66 years in prison, no outburst, no statement, no appeal on emotion. The court adjourned. The case was closed. But for the families involved, especially for Jordan Watson, who was only 4 when her mother disappeared, there was no restoration, only recognition that the questions had been answered and the data had finally told the story. In April 2023, an envelope addressed to the Pima County Sheriff's Office arrived from an Illinois correctional facility. Inside was a handwritten letter from an inmate named Corey Fox. Serving a life sentence for an unrelated homicide, Fox claimed responsibility for the 2000 murder of Linda Watson. The letter described elements of the case with chilling specificity: a desert disposal site, a tool used to inflict head trauma, and an alleged contract arrangement for the killing. For a case long considered closed, the confession presented a legal and emotional complication. Watson had already been convicted in 2017 of Linda's murder and the subsequent killings of Marilyn Cox and Renee Farnsworth. The system had moved on, But this letter reopened old wounds and forced a review of whether justice had truly been served. Fox claimed he was hired by an unnamed intermediary to remove a woman involved in a custody battle in Tucson. He said he surveilled Linda's residence, entered through the back door, and used a tire iron to incapacitate her. He detailed that he wrapped the body in a bedsheet, transported it using a borrowed van, and buried it near a ridge northwest of the city. He wrote that he was promised a payment that never came. The tone of the letter alternated between boastful and evasive. At first glance, the details seemed compelling. Linda's skull had been discovered in a ridge area. The cause of death had been blunt force trauma. The crime had long appeared targeted and calculated. But once investigators began comparing Fox's narrative to the established forensic record, cracks emerged. The burial site coordinates he provided were approximate, but off by nearly 2.7 miles from where Linda's remains were found. He described the disposal process as shallow earth burial, but her skull had been exposed due to erosion, with no evidence of a full-body interment. The supposed weapon, tire iron, was inconsistent with fracture patterns. Forensic anthropologists had concluded the injury was delivered with a broader, flatter object. More importantly, no evidence existed that linked Fox to Arizona in the year 2000. Travel records, work history, and cell tower data placed him in Missouri during that time period. Investigators also noted that Fox had previously submitted false confessions in 2 other cold cases. In both instances, his claims were disproven through forensic contradictions and timeline analysis. Psychologists later classified his behavior as narcissistic confessionalism, a pattern in which convicted individuals seek notoriety by inserting themselves into high-profile crimes they did not commit. Despite the inconsistencies, the claim couldn't be ignored. Jordan Watson, now in her 20s, petitioned the county to reevaluate her father's conviction. She expressed doubt, citing the detailed description of the burial zone and the lack of physical evidence directly tying David Watson to the scene. Her request was reviewed by the Conviction Integrity Unit. A full re-audit of the case was initiated. Independent forensic analysts re-examined the chain of evidence. The outcome remained unchanged. No new physical evidence was introduced. No new witnesses came forward. The biological trace in Linda's hallway, the untracked 5-hour window, the station vehicle movement, the legal motive timing, and the consistent behavioral pattern across 3 deaths all remained intact. The confession, in contrast, offered no verifiable element that could withstand forensic scrutiny. The final report issued by the district attorney's office stated, "The confession submitted by inmate Corey Fox lacks credibility, introduces factual errors, and contradicts multiple established points of forensic evidence. As such, the original conviction stands." For the legal system, the matter was resolved. But for the people connected to Linda Watson, especially her daughter, it was another painful chapter in a story that had never fully healed. A verdict could bring accountability. It could not restore clarity. The shadow of doubt introduced by Fox's confession would remain, not because it had merit, but because it reawakened uncertainty. In Tucson, the case closed a second time. But cases like this rarely fade. They linger in archives, in public memory, and in institutional lessons. Law enforcement agencies pointed to the Watson investigation as a reminder of how procedural gaps, untracked vehicle movement, evidence delay, witness loss, can compromise the timeline of justice. Had Linda's case moved faster in 2000, perhaps the evidence would have been clearer. Had her disappearance been treated as a homicide from the outset, perhaps Marilyn and Renee might not have died. Had forensic preservation been more rigorous, perhaps Fox's letter would have been easier to disprove within minutes, not months. Instead, what remained was a conviction built on consistency, weighed against a confession built on misdirection. Sometimes justice doesn't come quickly, and when it does arrive, it may not feel complete. But cases like Linda Watson's remind us why persistence, forensic science, and community memory matter. If you've made it this far, here's what I've learned. Never assume silence means safety. If someone disappears, speak up. If something feels wrong, trust your instinct. The hardest truths are often the ones buried longest, but they still deserve to be brought to light. What do you think? Can a delayed conviction still be called justice? Or do years of uncertainty permanently damage trust in the system? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonated with you. If you found this video powerful or thought-provoking, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. And if it didn't hit the mark for you, I'd still love to know why, and where in the world you tuned in from. Let's keep the conversation going.